And a lot of people think that precariousness has got this fundamental resonance with their life. So it doesn't matter if Guy Standing, for example, talks about precariousness bringing together migrant labourers, unemployed people in council estates, artists, all of these different groups of people. Do you think that just makes it amorphous and unusable?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with the whole phrase precariousness. I think people have been precarious and living in the margins of society and communities for generations. I'm not sure what it really brings to the table in terms of something new and novel, to be honest.
So where do you come from?
Glasgow.
And what sort of estate did you grow up on?
I grew up in a lot of different places, some council housing, some private housing, mostly council housing, socially deprived areas, lots of bad indicators of deprivation, lots of homelessness, drug abuse, alcoholism.
Okay, and living in a country now like Australia, there's this idea, I think, that's quite prevalent, and you hear it in a lot of seminars, that genuine disadvantage only affects non-white ethnic groups in lots of different ways, or seriously affects non-white ethnic groups. From your experience of living over here, do you think that has any credence, or?
No, I mean, I my experience of living over here is probably not as relevant as my experience of living over there.
Yeah.
I think living in Glasgow, growing up in Glasgow, I would say, yeah, that's not the case.
Yeah.
My experience, I don't think you could call my experience and the experience of socially excluded groups in Glasgow, despite the prevalence of all those problems, precarious. I think it's something much more long-term, entrenched. You know, to be marginalised and to live in the outskirts of society, you're not precarious. You're a long-term problem. Your problems are entrenched over a long time. You know, I wouldn't say you're going anywhere. You're a long-term social ill, and that exists in Glasgow, regardless of colour. That's for sure.
So in a sense, people in Glasgow, the sort of problems they're experiencing are not just short-term, unpredictable contingencies.
No.
These are unpredictable contingencies within the context of predictable misery over the course of generations.
I mean, this concept of precariousness and fragility has built in with it a kind of dynamism that's obviously connected to bigger issues of globalisation and transition. And, you know, to be precarious seems to suggest that you can grow out of it. There's a movement. You're either, you know, precarious, but you can become stronger. My experience of Glasgow and lots of other places in the United Kingdom is that this is long-term structural disadvantage.
Yeah. Okay. So thinking back to, say, I don't know, maybe even your dad or your grandparents. Culturally, how did they respond to the pressures that were placed on them in terms of material pressures and these sorts of things?
I don't know, that's a difficult question to answer. How did they respond? I think they bonded together socially a lot more. There was much more social community. They worked harder because they thought that was the answer. And they tried to get through it. You gritted your teeth and you got on with it. You know, you became grimmer and more northern, and you just got on with it. You put your head down, you trudge through. My father's favourite phrase was, life's hard and then you die. That to me sums up the north of the UK. Life's hard and then you die. You become a grim working class individual.
So when you're talking there about solidarity, people developing solidarity out of these responses to environmental pressures, what happens when those environmental pressures are taken away?
How do they respond?
What happens to the communities?
Well, I think they start to disintegrate a little bit. There's a sense, at least from my research in Australia, when you take away threat, you know, solidarity does decline, and neighbours stop talking to neighbours. So in our research, you have high levels of threat about crises, you know, acute disasters. you have moments in time where people really bond, really come together. But these are, in our research, quite affluent, mobile, well-educated white people.
Yeah, right.
They bond together temporarily. And then when the state tries to institutionalise aspects of that solidarity within communities, their self-interest comes back and they have to get on with their day jobs. And therefore they stop caring so much about their neighbours because their neighbours aren't facilitating the reduction of the threat.
Okay.
And therefore in our research we're starting to really question the notion of resilience in the longer term. You know, it's momentary and it's elusive.
Yeah.
That's slightly different from those long-term structural issues and the big grind of real chronic crises and chronic social exclusion across time. You know, there's a different type of solidarity at work there that's much more political, you know, and not based on an immediate threat.
Yeah, okay.
You know, and the power relation's completely different, you know.
People talk about the death of Aboriginal culture. But it seems to me that there's just various different ways in which people have adapted and evolved and all these different things. People also talk about the death of Northumbrian culture, or, I don't know, working class culture in the north of England and Scotland in general. Do you think you can talk about the death of culture?
No, I don't think you can. I think there's something that makes me Glaswegian and there's something that makes me Scottish. It's the difference is how tangible it is and how easy it is to describe.
Yeah.
You know, what it means to be Glaswegian now is felt rather than spoken.
Right.
I think that's sometimes the same with Scottishness, but it doesn't mean it's not there. It's just really difficult to tap into. And it is regional as well.
Yeah.
A Glaswegian's not got much to say to someone from the borders of Scotland, for example. You know, but if you go a little bit further south, you start to bump into people that you have got things that you want to say to, you know. And so there's a regional identity there. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, you know, struggles, I think there's a common bond there culturally, you know, when people struggle. Culture's going to exist because struggles are shared, you know. So even if you're fighting and you're struggling and you're, what the cultural markers were 50 years ago or 100 years ago don't exist anymore. The struggle kind of bonds you. And that's shared norms and shared meanings. And it's a guidance for behaviour, you know. What it means to be a working class Glaswegian today is completely different from what it means to be a working class Glaswegian 100 years ago. But the struggle's there and the structural problems are there and all those big issues are still there, so the struggle continues, you know. And in some ways it is the same because you're still fighting similar battles.
You know, I grew up in England, but to be told that my Englishness is the same as the Englishness of the royal family or something like that is not just like an error, it's also a bit annoying and serves simply to homogenise entire groups of people. I mean, what do you feel like if when people are, you know, if people talk about white people's experiences, what do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same, pretty much the same as you. I think there are different levels to that and different struggles. But again, I think there are people that have experiences which are completely different from mine. I can still associate with them culturally, if you like, but for me the starting point for a real shared identity has to be, at least in my biased, jaundiced way, some sense of hardship. That's what kind of unites me with someone on a personal level. You know, it's being able to having suffered and worked through some degree of suffering and came out the other side, whether that's social, economic or whatever. I think and that undermines any notion of colour to me.
One of the problems that we've faced in filming this documentary is that visually Brisbane and its surrounding areas do not look as bad as the places that I presume you and I grew up in. How do you reckon we can get around that? How can we explain the struggle in different ways? I don't know.
Yeah, aesthetically, it's going to be different, you know. Glasgow, the north of England, just looks terrible, whereas Australia just looks nicer. But, you know, the struggle's not aesthetic.
Yeah.
The struggle's on the narratives you hear. And the few times I've been exposed to real Indigenous narratives from real Indigenous people about problems of social exclusion, there's a natural association and affinity there that crosses over, and it comes from my own background. So the aesthetics completely different, but I would imagine the narrative and the ability of both groups to speak to each other it'll be similar, and there'll be an affinity there, because I certainly feel it. It's not based on a culture that I know or I really understand. It's based on the hardships. You know, the affinity is with the struggles that you go through, and it's a kind of shared identity there in that sense.
I think certain values, solidarity, equality, and non-domination, are just integral to any social group. If you haven't got them, you've got certain pathological relationships that just cause problems for people. In this context, obviously, we've got totally different groups of people coming together, but they've got similar sort of commitments. I think. I don't know if you felt this. Like, I always thought that at least within the cohort, the working class cohorts, there was this commitment to solidarity and equality and non-domination within the cohort that you might find in an Aboriginal context. I mean, have you felt that? Can you explain it? Or?
I don't know if I can explain it. I can certainly speak to the solidarity aspect of it. The solidarity is there, and it grows depending on the level of the threat. You know, so I'm sure you'll see similar levels of solidarity and perspectives of solidarity. So you're going to have two different, distinct narratives about solidarity. The really interesting thing is, can you bring those together? And if one can understand that the threat and the adversity is the same on the other side, then maybe there's a chance there.
Okay.
Because, you know, that's where the bonding comes from, and that's where resilience comes from. It's got to be a shared identity about threat.
About threat, okay. That's interesting.
Yeah, because that's the response. It's, you know, that's the response. The response is to hardship and it's to threat, and resilience comes through solidarity as a consequence. If you can convince two groups that the threats they face are similar, then maybe you can have international cooperation, solidarity to some degree. I don't know about the other aspects. You know,
equality? No. Some level of equality. If you think about
I don't know about that within groups though.
Within
I mean, in terms of a shared identity, I think maybe with equality. Solidarity is the most powerful one.
A couple of the core presumptions in the two groups have been, one from the Ashington side, which is that Aboriginal people are basically loincloth wearing, dark-skinned people who live out in the bush and all the rest of it. So you get all the romanticism and all that sort of stuff. And on the other hand, you get, I think, an assumption that white people, wherever they exist, live privileged lives and everything. Can you think of ways in which they would be, those experiences, by breaking down those experiences, you might lead to solidarity?
Oh, that's yeah, I can actually. I think both of them are obviously wrong to begin with, but in some ways the misperceptions kind of come from a common place. And I see there's an ability there to break down those barriers on the strength of that. And because you're not really you're dealing with two people with similar hardships, similar struggles, and a kind of similar space and attitude, it's easy enough to break those down through humour, and through connections through humour. You know, the points you were making about equality previously, you know, those are the kind of channels that you can break down walls through in a much more easier fashion than if you were dealing necessarily with middle class, working class relationships where the degrees of political correctness are so sensitive that they can't be broken down.
Yeah.
I think when you're dealing with two communities who are socially excluded, you get a much more forthright exchange, and it can come from those misperceptions, start from those kind of wrong places, and then the barriers are easier to break down, I think. For me, personally, when I come from, all I can think about is being in the room and listening to people talk about the same stuff that I know, and I think that gives me some degree of license to talk back to them on those terms, which are not academic, which are not necessarily intellectual. They're based on something shared, right? So I can feel myself moving, as not as an academic, as a person, moving towards those narratives. And kind of I felt it the other day at the seminar, because we immediately started talking about Scottishness, you know, and poverty and previous experiences, and you start to take that move towards the other side, and if that comes through humour, then all the better. But the movement's there and the dynamics there.